everyone, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning back in. You know, I recently was out fishing with a friend of mine when I saw this hanging in the tree. So I told my buddy I was going to go retrieve that slip bobber, and it turns out it's like brand new in great condition. But he gave me a really weird look. He's like, "You're a bass fisherman. Why do you want that slip bobber?" And the reality is because bobbers have a place in bass fishing as well as pretty much any other species of fish. If you're fishing for walleye, bluegill, crappie, it really doesn't matter. There's a use for bobbers. So, in my opinion, if I see a perfectly good bobber and I can retrieve it easily, I'm going to go get it. So, I wanted to do a quick episode on the different uses that I use a slip bobber for in the bass fishing world. You know, like I said, pretty much all other species of fish out there, anglers for them have uses for slip bobbers, but I've got a couple of pretty specific uses when I really like to throw a slip bobber. So that's what I'm going to go over today. But before I get into those, I do want to remind you guys that if you want to support the channel, check out some of the merchandise we have, like this cool smallmouth shirt that was done by Matt Stockton, a great artist out of the Detroit area. So you can check those out by going to the store on my YouTube homepage. You can click the store. It'll take you to the Spreadshirt link for that. Also, if you're looking for some help on your lakes in your area, check out the lake breakdowns that I do with fishthemoment.com. Myself, Randy Blockett, Johnny Schultz have all done, I mean, there's hundreds of them up at this point. But if we haven't covered the lake that you want, you can request a personal lake breakdown from yours truly as well. So check that out. The link's in the video description. Okay, guys. So a slip bobber, not just for panfish, not just for walleye. You can use it for bass. The most famous, technique in the bass world, I would say, is what they call a floatin fly. That's when you take like a hair jig, like this Kaylene's, or you can take a marabou jig, and you can float it under a floatin fly. This technique, I would say most people use it during the coldest period of the year, so the winter months into the very early pre-spawn period, and they're going to be using it where they're suspending that fly or that hair jig along like bluff walls and over deep points, places where you've got wintering fish that may starting to move up to think about staging for the pre-spawn period. But you're talking about water that's really cold, anywhere I would say from 50 degrees to ice up is a period where a floatin fly comes in handy. That's the one technique where I think a lot of people would recognize that a bobber actually does come into play in the bass fishing world. But I'm here to tell you that's not the only one. There's a lot of other uses for it, and it's something that I really feel like I need to incorporate more into my tournament fishing, because there's times it really, really does excel and make fishing easier. So I'm kind of surprised we don't see it more. I think there's a little bit of a stigma where people just don't want to be seen throwing a bobber, especially in a tournament situation. But I can assure you guys it really does work well. So here's a couple other uses. I've got one specifically what I like to do is, so I've got a slip bobber here. For those of you that don't know what a slip bobber is, a slip bobber is a bobber where you've got a straight hollow insert. So you put the line right through it and the bobber can slide freely up and down your line. So then what you do before you put your bobber on is you get a bobber stop. This is actually a Texas lock by Decoy, but it's basically just a bobber stop. People use bobber stops now in the bass fishing world for lots of different reasons, but generally not for what they were originally created for, which was a bobber stop. So what you do is you put one on your line. So you can see I've got one there. And then you put your bobber on. So when you make a cast, your slip bobber will slide up your line until it hits that bobber stop and stop. So you can set the bobber stop in an exact depth. So if you're fishing 8 feet of water and you want your bait 4 feet off the bottom, you put your bobber stop 4 feet up the line, and therefore you know your bait is 4 feet down. Well, this idea of suspending baits is where the bass fishermen can really look at a bobber to give them an advantage. So one of the things I like to do is take a wacky rig and suspend it under the bobber. So I'll take the wacky rig and I'll fish it in areas where I normally would throw a wacky rig, but I want to keep my bait there for a little bit longer. That's one of the advantages to a bobber. So if I throw the wacky rig and bobber, say next to a dock or under a dock, I'll let the wacky rig fall as it normally does. And say I'm fishing 4 feet of water, I can set it where it goes 3 feet down, so I know my wacky rig's not going to hit the bottom. At that point, once I see my bobber stand up, I know my bait is suspended a foot off the bottom. I'll let it sit there for a little bit. If I don't get bit, I'll give a quick pull on the line. That'll pull the bait back up to the bobber. And at that point, I can let it fall back down. So what you're doing is keeping the wacky rig almost in the exact same place. If I tried to pull the wacky rig back up to the surface just without the bobber, the bait's going to move probably 5 or 6 feet forward because my motion of pulling it up in the air is actually pulling it at me. The bobber is keeping it more suspended right under where the bobber's at. So you're going to move it forward, but you're going to move it forward maybe a foot, maybe 2 feet versus the 5 or 6 feet I would pull it forward with just my rod tip. So I'm able to fish a bait like a wacky rig around pieces of cover for a longer period of time. And I don't necessarily have to pull it all the way back up to the bobber. I can give it just a quick little, a 1 foot pull up and let it settle back down. And it's a good way to generate bites from fish that are a little bit more lethargic. And they're not used to seeing a wacky rig kind of just going up and down more, vertical in the water column. It's kind of what the normal routine would be is more of just I don't even know what you'd call it, just an up and down, but it's moving more horizontal in the water. So this is a great technique. The other thing I'll say with this technique, it's a really good thing. I do this a lot with my boys. It's a good way to fish for bass, but yet be an easy enough technique for young kids to get started. So I'll fish this under the bobber and they can watch the bobber just like they would be watching the bobber for bluegill or any other species. We'll cast the bobber out, let it sink. My boy Hank will pull the rod a little bit and then let it sink, and he's watching the bobber, and it's a visual thing. But it's not like it's just a beginner technique. You really can catch more fish by fishing it under a bobber. That's what I'm finding in the last couple of years of experimenting with this. So a wacky rig is a really good technique to put under a bobber. The next technique that I really like to do with it is to fish for suspended fish. So, if I've got fish that are suspended, say, in 10 foot of water over 60, and I can see them, but it's hard to keep my bait at that 10-foot range when I'm casting for them, I can rig up a slip bobber rig with something like my guppy head with a small minnow, basically what you'd use with like a Demiki rig. So that you throw this out, you have 10 foot of line. When the bobber hits, your bait then just suspends like that. And you can fish for the suspended fish at the exact range or depth that you've seen them on your electronics. It really makes you very efficient because you know your bait is always going to be at that depth. If you throw in a little bit of wave action, your bait is just going to be riding up and down just at that specific depth range. It's a really good way to trigger strikes. And again, I'm really surprised we don't see more people doing it because in the last couple of years of experimenting with this, I can tell you I've run into pods of suspended fish where this was by far the best technique to get them to bite. I like to use either a little Zoom Fluke Junior or a little Demiki Armor Shad. Just the normal bait that you'd use with, say, a Demiki rig. Just a small straight tail minnow bait that you can get the suspend at that level. You can also put on a small swim bait if you wanted, say a 3.3, and just kind of slowly move the bait through the bobber across the surface. And what you're doing is you're dragging that swim bait at a nice slow pace, but you're always keeping it at the depth that you've got it suspended. That's the whole idea of the bobber here. And that's why I'm really surprised we don't see more people using slip bobbers in the bass fishing world, because with the electronics that we have nowadays, where we see the fish at a specific range, and it's all about making sure we're putting that bait right in front of that fish, we now can very quickly adjust the bobber stop to the exact depth that we want to make sure that we're putting the bait right in front of those fish's face. It's the same thing with like brush piles. You can set this and suspend, say a small minnow bait. You can suspend it right over the top of the brush pile and just let it sit there now. There's no other technique that I know of where you can do that without getting snagged. So you can see that the brush pile's in 12 feet of water, it comes up to 6 feet, and you want to suspend it right over the top of it. You can adjust the bobber stop to 6 feet down. It truly is something that we are missing out in the bass fishing world. So I'm really surprised we're not seeing more people doing it. I'm going to do some videos on it this summer and show you the actual fishing of it. But I figured I would just do a quick breakdown in terms of tackle and equipment and just explain some of the different techniques as to how you can apply the bobber. So I hope it was helpful, guys. Hey, next time you see a slip bobber that's just sitting there in a tree, grab it and apply it to some bass fishing. It really will give you some ideas as to good ways to approach some fish that maybe you weren't able to catch before. So I hope you enjoyed the video, guys. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. Stay tuned, another video coming out tomorrow.